A 10-year-old girl is running through a freezing rainstorm in a town that forgot it existed, and a black pickup truck is following her with its headlights off. She isn't running toward the police. She isn't running toward a neighbor's porch light or a gas station or anywhere that normal children run when the world turns dangerous. She's running toward the one place in Harlow, Pennsylvania that looks like it should be avoided at all costs. A dark motorcycle shop with cracked windows, engine grease on every surface, and men inside who've seen the worst this world can produce. And somehow, she knows it's the only place she'll be safe. If you've ever wondered what real protection looks like, not the kind that wears a badge or makes promises it can't keep, but the kind that has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, stay until the end of this story. It will change how you see danger and brotherhood and what broken men are actually capable of. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Let's get into it. The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Ryder Cole finally stopped pretending he was going to sleep. He'd been sitting in the same chair since 11, the old wooden one near the back of the shop that creaked when he shifted his weight and left a permanent indentation from the years he'd spent in it, staring at nothing, listening to the sound of Pennsylvania winter trying to get through the walls. The wood stove in the corner was burning low. The fluorescent light above the tool rack had been flickering for 2 weeks, and nobody had fixed it because fixing small things felt pointless when you were surrounded by machinery that actually mattered. Ryder was 38 years old and built like a man who had once carried other men on his back, broad through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, with hands that bore the evidence of every machine he'd ever broken apart and rebuilt. His left shoulder sat slightly lower than his right, a permanent reminder of a deployment injury that the military had classified as minor in the paperwork and that had not felt minor even once in the 9 years since. He wore a plain gray thermal under his leather vest, the vest soft and dark with age, the patches on it faded enough that only people who already knew what they meant could read them. His face was the kind of face that made strangers cross the street. Not because he was violent, though he was capable of it, and anyone who'd served with him knew exactly how capable, but because his eyes carried the flat, patient look of someone who had already calculated every exit in the room the moment he walked in. He didn't perform danger. He simply contained it. The shop was called Cold Iron Customs, though nobody outside of Harlow would have known it from the road. The sign had lost 2 letters in a windstorm the previous November, and Ryder hadn't replaced them. The building itself was a converted auto shop that he'd bought for almost nothing 6 years ago when the town was still deciding whether to survive or finish dying. He'd rebuilt the interior himself, installing the lift, running new electrical, pouring the concrete in the side bay over a long August weekend with Mackie and Delt doing the mixing while he argued with the building inspector on the phone. It wasn't beautiful, but it was his. On nights like this, when the rain came sideways and the roads into town became mirrors of black ice, the shop felt like the only solid thing in Harlow. The other guys had gone home. Mackie back to his apartment over the hardware store, Delt to the trailer he'd been renting on Pender Road since his divorce came through. Hatch had left around 9 after drinking 2 cups of coffee he didn't want, and talking about nothing until he finally admitted he just hadn't felt like being alone. Ryder understood that. He hadn't said anything when Hatch left, just nodded, and Hatch had nodded back, and that had been enough. Now it was past midnight, and Ryder was alone with the rain and the sound of the stove and the particular kind of silence that has weight. He was reading, or trying to read, the same 3 pages he'd been on for 40 minutes, when he heard the sound. It came from outside. Feet on wet pavement, fast and irregular, the kind of rhythm that meant someone was running and not in the controlled way of someone jogging for exercise, but in the desperate, stumbling way of someone being chased. Ryder was out of the chair before the thought fully formed. He crossed the shop in 4 strides, pulled the side door open, and the cold hit him immediately. Not just cold, but wet, the kind of February air that soaks through clothing in seconds and reminds the body that it is fragile. The alley beside the shop was dark. The streetlight at the corner had been broken since December. He could see the rain slanting through the glow from the shop window, and not much else. Then he saw her. She was small, too small for the size of the fear on her face, running toward him along the alley with her arms pumping and her feet splashing through the standing water and her dark hair plastered flat to her skull from the rain. She wore a thin jacket over what looked like pajama pants, nothing close to appropriate for a night like this, and she was crying, though she was trying not to, trying to keep her breathing controlled even as her body shook. She saw Ryder standing in the doorway, and for one fraction of a second she slowed, calculating him the way all children instinctively calculate men, measuring the danger of the known against the danger of the unknown. And then she made a decision that surprised him. She ran directly at him, not to him. At him, like she intended to run through him if he didn't move. He didn't move. He opened his arms slightly, a posture he wasn't even aware he knew how to make, and she collided with him at full speed and grabbed 2 fistfuls of his leather vest and pressed her face against his chest and said nothing for 3 full seconds while she tried to breathe. Ryder put one hand on the back of her head, gentle in a way that felt foreign to his own hands, and looked past her into the dark alley. That's when he saw the truck. It was parked at the far end of the alley, engine idling, headlights off. A dark pickup, black or very dark blue, he couldn't tell in this light, sitting completely still with its engine running, not moving, not leaving, just sitting there with its wipers going slow and its engine idling, like whoever was behind the wheel had all the time in the world. Ryder looked at the truck for a long moment. The truck did not look away. The girl finally pulled her face back enough to look up at him, and he got his first real look at her. 10, maybe 11, dark eyes wide and wet with more than just rain, a cut on her lower lip that was fresh and had probably come from a fall rather than anything worse. Her jaw was set in a way that told him she had not planned to cry in front of anyone tonight and was furious at herself for doing it. "He's following me," she said. 3 words, matter of fact, like she was reporting something that had happened before and she was giving him the relevant information because she needed him to understand the situation, not because she expected him to be shocked by it. Ryder looked at the truck again. "How long?" "Since Maple Street." She swallowed. "Maybe longer." He stepped back inside the doorway, taking her with him, and reached for the heavy work light he kept on the hook near the door, the kind that could illuminate an entire engine bay. He turned it on and aimed it down the alley toward the truck. The truck didn't move. The wipers kept going. Ryder stood there with the child pressed against his side and the work light cutting through the rain and the truck sitting at the end of the alley like a held breath. And something inside his chest that he'd kept sealed for years shifted slightly, like old stone moving in deep water. He brought her inside. The shop was warm after the cold, the wood stove's low burn still enough to take the bite off the air, and she stood in the center of the room dripping on the concrete floor and looking around at the bikes and the tools and the bare walls with the focused attention of someone cataloging her surroundings out of habit. He noticed that. She wasn't gawking, she was assessing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Avery." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a pragmatic gesture. "Avery Quinn." "Ryder Cole." He grabbed the old wool blanket he kept draped over the stool near the stove. He'd used it for cold morning shifts and never thought much about it before now, and held it out to her. "You hurt anywhere?" She considered the question seriously, like it deserved a real answer. "I twisted my ankle, but I can walk on it." "Okay." He took a step toward the window, keeping himself between her and the front of the shop. "Is there somebody I should call?" "My mom." Her voice changed on that word, dropped slightly, became younger somehow. The composure she'd been performing slipping just barely enough to show what was underneath it. "We live on the other side of Callaway, apartment 4C, but she doesn't know I left." "Why did you leave?" She looked at him steadily. "Because he was outside." Ryder didn't ask who, not yet. He picked up his phone from the workbench and called Mackie first, because Mackie was the fastest, and because if there was a vehicle parked at the end of an alley watching a child run through the rain, Ryder wanted more eyes before he went back outside. While the phone rang, he kept watching the alley window. The truck had moved forward, just slightly, maybe 20 feet, but it was still there. Mackie answered on the second ring, groggy and then instantly not. "Yeah." "You need to come in." A pause. Mackie knew that tone. "How many?" "One truck. One kid." Ryder paused. "Bring Delt." He hung up and turned back to Avery. She had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and was standing with her back to the workbench, facing the door, her ankles crossed, her face steady. She looked exhausted in the specific way that children who've learned not to sleep deeply look exhausted, like the weariness went down to the bone. "How long has he been following you?" Ryder asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked her own question, the way smart people do when they want to understand who they're talking to before they commit to honesty. "Do you know a man named Gavin Rhodes?" The name meant nothing to him. He shook his head. "He followed us here," she said. "From Easton. We moved here in September because my mom thought he didn't know where we went." A pause. She was wrong. The words were careful and flat, and carried the weight of someone who had processed terrible information many times over, who'd learned to hold it without falling. Ryder felt something tighten behind his sternum. "What does he want?" he asked, though he suspected he already understood the shape of it. Avery looked at him with eyes that were far older than her face. "He wants us to be scared," she said, "and my mom to come back." Before Ryder could respond, headlights swept through the front window. The narrow, angled beam of a motorcycle cutting through the rain followed seconds later by another. Mackie and Delt. He heard their engines kill outside the front, heard the quick stomp of boots on the step. Delt came through the front first, rain on his jacket, 6'2", a former combat medic, with a salt and pepper beard, and the permanently alert eyes of someone who'd triaged casualties in the dark and never fully stopped doing it. He saw Avery immediately, took in the blanket, the wet hair, the cut lip, and his entire expression shifted in the barely perceptible way that it did when he switched from regular human being into whatever it was he became when someone needed care. He crouched down to Avery's level without being invited to. "Hi, you hurt?" "Twisted ankle." "Can I look at it?" She considered him for half a second, then sat down on the nearest stool and extended her foot. He unlaced her sneaker with practiced efficiency, checked the joint with 2 fingers, and said, "Not broken, just sprained," with the quiet authority of someone who'd said similar things in far worse circumstances. Mackie came in behind him, shaking rain off his jacket, already looking at Ryder. Mackie was 41 and had the compact, dense build of a wrestler gone to seed slightly, which was deceptive because Ryder had seen him move when it mattered, and there was nothing soft about how he moved. He had a long scar on his jaw from something that had happened in a bar in Kandahar that nobody ever fully explained, and that Mackie himself refused to discuss with anything other than a mild shrug. "Truck's still there," Mackie said. "I know." "Want me to pull?" "No." Ryder said it flat and final. "Not yet." Mackie accepted that. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the window. Ryder called Avery's mother. The phone rang 4 times before a woman picked up, and when she did, her voice had the jagged edge of someone who'd been awake and afraid for hours, but was trying to sound calm. "Hello? Ms. Quinn, my name is Ryder Cole. I have your daughter. She's safe. She's at Cold Iron Customs on Baker Alley." The sound on the other end was not quite a sob and not quite a breath. It was the sound of a person whose body releases terror all at once. "She's okay," he said again. "She's warm and she's not hurt." "I'm coming." Already moving, already in motion, he could hear it. Please don't let her go outside." "I won't," he said. "Ms. Quinn." He paused. "There's a dark pickup truck parked in the alley. You know who's driving it?" The silence that followed was the kind that answers. "Yes," Danielle Quinn said finally, and her voice had changed, hardened at the edges, become something that had been polished into bluntness through months of grinding. "Yes, I know exactly who's driving it." She arrived 19 minutes later. She'd run most of the way, he could tell. Her hair was soaked and she was breathing in the quick, shallow way of exertion and fear combined. And she wore a coat that was too thin for the weather, thrown on over what she'd been sleeping in. She was 34, maybe 35, with the same dark eyes as her daughter and the same quality of watchful steadiness that on a child looks precocious and on an adult looks like something hard-won. She came through the door and went directly to Avery and held her for a long time without speaking, and Avery held her back with a fierce, quiet intensity, and neither of them made the sounds you might expect. They just held on, like they'd practiced holding on. Ryder gave them 30 seconds, then crossed to where Danielle sat with Avery. He's still outside? She asked without looking up. Yes. He'll wait, she said. He's good at waiting. Something about the way she said it, the resignation folded into the anger, folded into the bone-deep fatigue, made Ryder look at her differently. This wasn't a woman in crisis. This was a woman who had been in crisis for so long she'd learned to function inside it. How long? He asked. She finally looked up. 14 months. Her jaw set. I have a file. 68 pages. Photos, messages, police reports. Everything. I went to the police in Easton 3 separate times. A pause. They told me to document. And then they closed the case. Said there wasn't enough to charge him. Mackie, from across the room, made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word. Delt had found a bag of frozen peas in the small freezer near the back. They kept it for exactly this kind of purpose, though the guys would never admit that, and had Avery's ankle elevated on a milk crate with the peas wrapped in a rag on top. Avery was leaning against her mother's arm, eyes half closed, the exhaustion finally winning over the adrenaline. Ryder walked to the side window and looked at the alley. The truck had moved again, closer now, close enough that he could see the shape of a person behind the wheel through the rain, head slightly tilted, like they were watching the building with patient, idle interest, the way you might watch a television program you'd already seen but didn't mind watching again. Ryder had seen that posture before, not in criminals, in surveillance, the particular stillness of someone trained to wait without betraying discomfort. He turned back to the room. Hatch used to be a deputy, he said to no one in particular. Mackie looked up. You want to call him? Yeah. Ryder picked up his phone again. And when you call Delt, tell him to come through the back. Delt's already here. I mean the other one. Mackie knew who he meant. He nodded. Ryder stepped away from the window and looked at Danielle Quinn, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone trying to calculate whether to trust a man she'd just met. I'm not going to promise you anything, he said, because he'd learned years ago that promises made in charged moments were the ones most likely to get people hurt. But nobody's getting to your daughter tonight. Danielle held his gaze. He'll be back. Then we'll be here. She swallowed, looked down at Avery, who had finally fallen into the shallow, twitching sleep of total exhaustion, looked back up at Ryder. Why? She asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking, trying to understand the logic of a stranger who'd taken her daughter in off a rainy street without hesitation. Ryder looked at her for a moment without answering, because there was an answer. There was a real, specific, deeply personal answer that lived in a part of him he'd kept locked for 9 years. But it wasn't the right time, and she wasn't owed that yet. Because she asked, he said. Outside, the truck's engine revved once, a short, deliberate sound, like a clearing of a throat, and then went quiet again. The truck didn't leave, and neither did Ryder. Hatch arrived 20 minutes later, his deputy's jacket still hanging in the closet he no longer had the right to open, his face carrying the particular tension of a man who missed his badge and his purpose in equal measure. He came in, saw the sleeping girl, saw Danielle Quinn's expression, looked at Ryder. What are we dealing with? He asked. Ryder answered him, and as he talked, he watched Hatch's face change. Not dramatically, Hatch didn't do dramatic, but in the way a man's face changes when he hears something familiar. When he recognizes a pattern he's seen before and hoped not to see again. Gavin Rodess? Hatch repeated. You know the name? Hatch was quiet for 3 full seconds. Not him specifically. Another pause. But the last time I ran a case like this in Carver County, the file got pulled before I could finish it. He looked at the window. Never knew why. Just got a call from the lieutenant saying to drop it. The room went still. Danielle Quinn had heard. She was looking at Hatch with the fierce, brittle attention of someone who has been told their pain is unverifiable too many times and is now calculating whether this new piece of information explains something. When was this? She asked. Hatch gave her the year. She went white. That's when we moved to Easton, she said quietly. We ran from someone else first, before Gavin. Ryder looked at her. What was his name? Hatch asked. She told him. And the room temperature dropped by 10 degrees that had nothing to do with weather, because Hatch recognized that name too. And suddenly, what had felt like a terrible but isolated situation, a frightened child, a stalker in a truck, a dark alley in a forgotten Pennsylvania town, began to look like something else entirely. Not an isolated threat, a chain. And somewhere at the far end of that chain, in a darkness none of them had seen yet, something was waiting with the patience of a man who had never once been stopped. The name Danielle Quinn had just spoken hung in the air above Cold Iron Customs like smoke that nobody wanted to breathe. Hatch didn't move for a long moment. He was standing near the workbench with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere between Danielle's face and the middle distance, the way a man's eyes go when information is reorganizing itself into a shape he doesn't want to recognize. His jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on the name, testing its weight, hoping he'd misheard. He hadn't misheard. "Say it again," he said. Danielle Quinn said the name again, quietly. Like she'd learned to say difficult things quietly so they didn't break anything on the way out. Hatch looked at Ryder. Ryder looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, something passed between them that Mackie and Delt registered without understanding. A recognition, a recalibration, a silent agreement that the shape of this problem had just changed significantly. "Who is he?" Mackie asked. "Someone I should have kept looking at," Hatch said. His voice was flat, the particular flatness of a man suppressing anger at himself. "Case I worked 2 years ago. Missing woman out of Carver County. Name was Tessa Aldrich, 31, 2 kids, had been trying to relocate for months. I pulled her file, started making calls, and 3 days later got told to drop it." "By who?" "Lieutenant Graves." Hatch paused, said there was a conflict of interest, didn't specify. "And the woman?" Delt asked. Hatch's jaw tightened. "Never found." The wood stove ticked in the silence. Outside, the rain had not let up. If anything, it was heavier now, drumming against the metal roof of the shop in waves, the sound rising and falling like breathing. Avery was still asleep on the cot Delt had improvised from the folding table near the back, her ankle wrapped in the rag-covered peas, her face slack with the absolute unconsciousness of a child whose body has finally overruled her mind. Danielle sat beside her with one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, not gripping, just touching, proof of presence, of continuity. But Danielle's eyes were on Hatch. "Tessa Aldrich," she said carefully. "I don't know that name." "You wouldn't," Hatch said. It was kept quiet. He stopped. Too quiet. "The man whose name I gave you," Danielle began. "I know who he was," Hatch said, and something in the way he said was made Danielle's breath change. "I said, I ran a case like yours, not the same case. The man you're talking about, we crossed paths once when I was still in uniform. He was connected to something I couldn't get traction on. Every time I tried to pull the thread, it went cold." He looked at the window. "Never knew if that was coincidence or something else." "It wasn't coincidence," Danielle said. "He had someone helping him. Every time I reported, every time I filed, the reports either disappeared or got reclassified, or I got a call back telling me the matter was resolved." She said the word resolved like it was a stone she was spitting out. Nothing was ever resolved. We just kept running. Ryder had been standing near the side window through all of this, watching the alley. The truck was still there. It hadn't moved in 40 minutes. He could see the faint glow of what might have been a phone screen behind the rain-blurred glass. A small rectangle of pale light that appeared and disappeared at irregular intervals, checking something or documenting something. That last possibility sat wrong in his stomach. He turned back to the room. "Hatch," he said, "the case you worked, the missing woman, is the file still open?" "Technically cold case. Active enough that it's not archived, not active enough that anyone's working it." Hatch hesitated. "Why?" "Because if Danielle's history and Tessa Aldrich's history connect to the same name, then what's sitting in that truck out there isn't a random stalker." Ryder said it evenly, the way he'd learned to say things in briefing rooms, remove the emotion from the words, put it in the information itself, let the information do the work. "It's a point on a longer line." The shop went quiet again. Mackie uncrossed his arms. He was looking at the window now, too. "So what's the play?" "Tonight?" Ryder looked at Danielle. "She and Avery stay here. We document the truck. Mackie, I need plates, make, model, everything you can get without going close enough to spook whoever's in there. Delt, I need you to see if you can reach Mara. Delt's eyebrows shifted. Voss? She's still with county investigations? Far as I know. Then reach her. Ryder paused. Don't tell her everything. Tell her we have a situation involving a prior case that Hatch can walk her through. Let her decide if she wants to come in. Delt pulled out his phone and stepped toward the back of the shop. Danielle Quinn was watching Ryder with an expression he couldn't entirely read. It had gratitude in it, but underneath the gratitude was something older and more cautious, the learned suspicion of a woman who had placed her trust in official structures many times and received nothing useful in return. You said you're a mechanic, she said. I am. Why are you doing this? He'd known the question was coming again, had known it since the first time she asked it. The difference now was that the room was fuller, there were more ears, and the honest answer was one he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in this shop or anywhere else. We'll talk about that later, he said. Not unkindly, deliberately. Danielle studied him for another moment, then apparently decided to accept the non-answer for now. She looked down at Avery, smoothed a strand of wet hair back from her daughter's forehead with a gesture so practiced it was clear she'd done it 10,000 times, and said nothing else. Mackie went out the back. He was gone 11 minutes. When he came back in, his jacket was soaked through and his expression had the controlled neutrality of a man who has seen something that merits a reaction he's choosing not to give in front of civilians. He crossed directly to Ryder and spoke low. Pennsylvania plates. Partial. Couldn't get the last 3 without going closer. Dark blue F-150, maybe 20, 19 or 2020. There's a second phone on the dash, looks like it's recording, front-facing camera. Ryder absorbed that. Recording. The truck wasn't just watching, it was documenting their response. He knew she'd run here, Mackie said, even quieter now. Or he knew she'd run somewhere, and he wanted to see where. He was testing her options, Ryder said. Testing yours, too. The understanding of that landed in the room like something physical. This wasn't a man who'd followed a child out of impulse. This was a man who operated with strategy, who understood how fear worked and how it could be used to gather information about the people trying to resist it. He hadn't approached the shop. He hadn't threatened anyone. He'd simply parked and watched and waited and let them make all the moves while he recorded everything. Ryder's shoulder ached the way it always ached in cold weather, a deep grinding complaint from the old injury that he'd learned to carry the way you carry chronic things, not by eliminating them, but by letting them exist alongside everything else. He rolled it once, unconsciously, and caught Delt watching him from across the room with the quiet clinical attention that Delt could never quite turn off. Voss will be here by 3, Delt said. She wasn't happy about the hour. She never is. She was also not unhappy, if that distinction matters. It mattered. Detective Mara Voss was the kind of investigator who complained about being contacted at unusual hours, primarily because she had never once in her career declined to respond to an unusual hours contact. She was 43, 12 years in county investigations, divorced twice from the job rather than from specific people, with a mind that processed pattern recognition the way other people processed faces. Instinctively, constantly, compulsively. She and Ryder had crossed paths 3 years ago during an insurance fraud investigation that had briefly touched the shop and had been resolved without incident. And since then, she'd operated with a kind of professional proximity to Cold Iron that had never been formalized into anything official. She trusted them, with reservations, which was the only rational position. While they waited, Ryder made coffee. It was a functional act. He needed something to do with his hands, and the shop needed caffeine if they were going to function clearly until morning. But it was also something else, something he wasn't analyzing. The act of making the coffee meant the shop was open, was working, was a place where people could be fed and warm. He didn't examine why that felt important right now. He was pouring when Mackie came and stood beside him at the small counter near the back wall. "You know what this looks like?" Mackie said. "Yeah." "You know what the guys are going to think when this spreads?" Ryder poured a mug and set it down. "Tell me." "They're going to think you made a unilateral call to take on something that's bigger than a missing kid and a stalker in a truck. They're going to want to know the parameters, Delt especially. Mackey's voice was low, not hostile. The voice of a man trying to get real information into the room before emotion filled all the available space. He's been here before, Ryder. The thing that went sideways in Marietta. He's not going to want to go sideways again. Ryder knew about Marietta. They all did. A situation 2 years before the shop when some of them had still been loosely connected through their post-service chaos rather than through any organized structure. A domestic violence situation that had looked straightforward and turned into something that cost one of their members 6 months in county on an assault charge that was eventually reduced but never fully disappeared. The man they'd gone to protect had turned out to be more complicated than the situation had appeared. Not innocent, not guilty either, just impossibly complicated the way human beings are when you try to reduce them to roles. Delt had been in the middle of it, had made a call that had seemed right at the time and had not, in any final accounting, been wrong, but had not been right enough to prevent consequences. He'd carried Marietta in the same place Ryder carried his shoulder, quietly, constantly, with a particular care not to press on it in public. "This isn't Marietta," Ryder said. "That's what you said about the thing in Williamsport." That also wasn't Marietta. Mackey picked up the mug Ryder had poured and wrapped both hands around it. "I'm not arguing with you. I'm telling you what the room's going to sound like when we're all in it together, and Delt wants the parameters, and you have to explain why you let a kid in off the street instead of calling family services." "Because it was the middle of the night and there was a truck in the alley recording us," Ryder said. "And because family services in this county has a response time of 4 to 6 hours on a non-emergency call, and that truck would have had 4 to 6 hours to—" "I know," Mackey said. "I'm not arguing. I'm warning you." Ryder looked at him. Mackey held his gaze steadily. He had the kind of face that had stopped being easy to read about 20 years ago. Not closed, exactly, but compressed. The expressions layered so tightly over each other that you had to know him well to separate them. Right now, Ryder could see concern and loyalty running in parallel, without either one overriding the other, which was exactly what Mackey was. "Warn me about what, specifically?" Ryder asked. "About the fact that you're going to want to follow this wherever it goes," Mackey said. "And that wherever it goes might be somewhere that the rest of us have to decide whether to follow." He paused. "And that you're not going to ask, you're going to assume." The accuracy of that landed hard. Ryder picked up his own mug. "You're right," he said. "I am going to assume." "I know." Mackey took a drink. "I'm also still here at 2 in the morning in a rainstorm. So." They stood in silence for a moment, which was as close as either of them came to making declarations. Mara Voss arrived at 2:47 in a car that had seen better years, wearing civilian clothes and a county investigations jacket thrown over them that somehow looked more official than anything she wore on shift. She was compact and dark-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from years of not slouching in rooms where people were trying to dismiss you. She came in, assessed the shop in one full rotation of her eyes, registered Danielle and the sleeping child, and Hatch's presence with a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise, and came directly to Ryder. "Walk me through it," she said. He walked her through it. All of it. Avery's arrival, the truck, Danielle's history, the 68 pages of documentation, and then Hatch's connection to the Tessa Aldrich case and the name Danielle had given them. Voss listened without interrupting, which was one of her skills. She had a particular quality of attention that felt less like listening and more like recording. Her eyes rarely blinked when she was processing, which unnerved people who didn't know her. When Ryder finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. "The name you just gave me," she said to Danielle. "Can you write it down for me?" Danielle wrote it on the back of a shop receipt. Voss looked at it. Her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her jaw shifted fractionally, tightening, the kind of micro-tension that meant a connection had just made contact. "Hatch," she said without looking up. "The Aldrich case, what was the case number?" Hatch gave it from memory. Voss's head came up. She looked at him with the full weight of that unblinking attention. That file was transferred to state jurisdiction 8 months ago. "I know," Hatch said. I wasn't told." "You should have been." "I know that too." She looked back down at the name on the receipt. "This individual appears in 3 separate investigations that I'm aware of. 2 in this county, one in Mercer. In each instance, the cases were either suspended, reclassified, or transferred before they reached the indictment phase. She folded the receipt with precise movements and put it in her jacket pocket. I have been trying to understand the mechanism for that for 8 months. The room was very still. What mechanism? Ryder asked. Someone with access to case management systems and enough political currency to quietly redirect investigations without triggering oversight review. She paused. Not many people can do that. The list is short. How short? Mackie asked. Short enough that the people on it are the reason I've been running this quietly. She looked at Ryder. How many people outside this room know what was discussed tonight? Nobody. Keep it that way. She looked at the window, at the alley, at the rain. The truck is still there? As of 40 minutes ago. Don't engage it. Don't approach it. Don't let anyone in this building go out that alley until I tell you. She turned back to Ryder. I need 48 hours. For what? To make a call to someone I trust who has access to the state-level case records and won't ask me why I'm asking. She met his eyes directly. This is bigger than a stalker in a truck, Ryder. If what Danielle has documented connects to what I've been building, this is a structure, a system. And I need to know how far it goes before anyone does anything that can't be undone. The word system sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. Danielle Quinn had heard all of it. She was sitting very upright now, Avery still sleeping against her shoulder, her face carrying an expression that Ryder couldn't name immediately and then could. It was the expression of a woman hearing her years of invisible suffering described in official language for the first time. The validation of it was not relief. It was something closer to grief. The particular grief of being right about something you'd prayed you were wrong about. I have 68 pages, Danielle said. I know, Voss said. I'll need them. I'll need to know they won't disappear. Voss looked at her directly. I can't make that promise about every institution. I can make it about myself. Danielle held her gaze for a long moment, weighing something invisible. Then she nodded, once, the nod of someone who has run out of alternatives and is choosing the least dangerous direction available. The night continued. At some point after 4, the truck finally moved, rolled quietly to the end of the alley, and turned north on Baker without its headlights coming on until it was half a block away. A deliberate choice, a message of its own that said, I was never afraid of you, and I'm leaving because I choose to, not because you made me. Mackie saw it go. He told Ryder. Ryder noted it without comfort because the departure of the truck didn't mean the departure of whatever sat behind the wheel. By 5:30, Danielle and Avery were settled in the small back office on the cot and the folding chair, both of them finally sleeping in the way people sleep when the immediate danger lifts. Not well, not deeply, but enough. Hatch had gone home to pull what records he still had access to from his deputy years. Voss had left to make her calls from somewhere secure. Delt had fallen asleep in the chair near the stove. Ryder did not sleep. He sat at the workbench with the cold coffee and the low light and let himself be still for the first time since the side door had opened and a small girl had run at him through the rain. He thought about what Mackie had said, about assumptions, about following something wherever it went and expecting the people around him to follow without being asked. He thought about the name Danielle had said. He thought about Hatch's face when he heard it. He thought about his sister. The thought of her was specific and physical, the way thoughts of people you failed always are, never abstract, always landing in the body somewhere. In his case, it landed in the left side of his chest, slightly below the collarbone, a tightness that had no medical explanation and that he'd carried for 9 years. He didn't let himself think about her often. When he did, it was usually involuntary, triggered by something he didn't see coming, some angle of light, or specific phrasing, or the particular quality of a woman's voice when she was trying to hold something terrible together. Tonight, it was Avery's face, the steadiness of it, the ancient patience in it. His sister Carla had looked like that once, had that same quality of a person who'd learned to be self-sufficient inside their own fear. He'd been 29 when she'd first tried to tell him what was happening to her, and he'd been, not disbelieving exactly, but insufficiently believing. He'd offered her the particular failure of people who care, but can't yet hold the full weight of what they're being told. He'd asked the wrong questions. He'd waited for more evidence, when what she needed was for him to act on what she'd already given him. She'd stopped talking to him 8 months after that. Then she'd moved. Then she'd stopped answering calls. By the time he understood the full shape of what she'd been trying to tell him, she'd disappeared in the way that people disappear when the world fails them long enough. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the contact growing thinner, and then thread-like, and then absent. He'd looked for her twice, officially, and been told both times that there was insufficient grounds for a missing persons investigation because she was an adult who had moved voluntarily. He'd stopped looking eventually, which was the thing he could not forgive himself for. The stove ticked. Delt snored softly from the chair. The rain tapped against the roof in the slow, exhausted way of a storm winding down. Ryder picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. He was still sitting there when Mackie came in from outside at 6:15, collar up against the early morning air, carrying 2 paper bags from the diner on Clement that opened at 6. He set one bag in front of Ryder without comment. Ryder opened it. Egg sandwich, the specific kind. American cheese, no condiment, the roll slightly too toasted, that Mackie knew he would want without asking because they'd been doing this particular exchange for 6 years. "Delt's awake," Mackie said. "He wants to talk." Ryder already knew what the talk would be about. About parameters. About parameters. Ryder ate half the sandwich in 4 bites, because he hadn't eaten since noon the previous day, and his body was making that known in the way it did when he'd pushed it past the point of polite suggestion. Then he set it down and looked at Mackie. "He wants out?" he asked, not defensive, just needing to know. "No," Mackie said. "He wants in. On his terms." "What terms?" "That's what he wants to tell you." Delt was sitting upright in the chair now, the folding chair posture of a man whose spine never fully relaxed even in sleep, finishing the last of a cold coffee with the mechanical efficiency of someone consuming fuel rather than enjoying a beverage. He looked at Ryder when Ryder crossed the room, and the look was the one Ryder recognized from the years before the shop. Not the medic look, not the brother look, but the other one. The one that said, "I'm going to say something that might make you angry, and I'm going to say it anyway because that's what I do." "You're going to go wherever this leads," Delt said. No preamble. "Yeah," Ryder said. "If it leads to whoever's been shutting down these cases, you're going to want to go at them directly." "Not directly?" Ryder. "I mean it." Ryder pulled a stool out and sat on it, eye level with Delt, close enough for honesty. "Voss said she needs 48 hours to identify the mechanism. We give her 48 hours. We give Danielle's documentation to Voss. We give Hatch time to pull what he has. We do nothing that can't be undone for 48 hours. Delt looked at him for a long moment. "And after 48 hours? After 48 hours, we see what shape this has. And if the shape is bad?" Ryder met his eyes. "Then we decide together." It was the word together that did it. Delt's jaw relaxed slightly. Not all the way, but enough. He'd waited for that word specifically, Ryder knew. He'd waited for evidence that Ryder understood the difference between being a person with strong convictions, acting on behalf of others, and being a person with strong convictions, acting alone and expecting others to absorb the consequences. "Okay," Delt said. "Together." He extended his hand. Not for a shake. Just extended it, palm up, the gesture that predated the shop by years, something they'd developed in the strange, informal language of men who'd been through things together that they didn't have proper words for. Ryder put his forearm against Delt's forearm, wrist to wrist, for 1 second. Old gesture. No explanation required. Mackie, who had been watching from the counter, turned back to his own sandwich. The morning came in slow. The rain had stopped somewhere after 6, leaving the town the particular wet gray of a winter morning that has wrung itself dry. The gutters running clear and the streets glazed with the residue of the storm. Avery woke first and came out of the back office wrapped in the blanket, hair matted, moving with the careful unself-consciousness of a child in a place she'd decided was safe. She looked around the shop, registered the men, and went directly to the stove. "It's cold in there," she said, informational. "I'll turn it up," Delt said, already standing. She watched him with the focused attention she'd been watching everything with. Are you a doctor? Medic, soldier kind. Is that different? Somewhat. He crouched to adjust the stove's intake. Better at emergencies, less good at the other stuff. She considered this seriously. My mom twisted her ankle last year. I put frozen peas on it. That's correct technique. I know, she said, with a simplicity that was not arrogance, but fact. Ryder watched this exchange from the workbench. Something in the particular quality of her matter-of-factness, the competence in it, the unsurprised capability of a child who'd learned very early to be useful in small crises, did the thing to his chest again, the thing from the night before. He looked away. Danielle came out of the back room 20 minutes later, moving like someone who needed coffee before anything else happened, and Mackie handed her a cup without being asked, which was either intuition or the habit of a man who'd raised a younger sibling and still moved through the world with that particular radar. She took the coffee. The truck's gone? Since before 5. She nodded, not relieved. Processing. He'll file a report, she said. Ryder looked up. What kind? That's what he does. Every time I documented him, he filed counter reports. That I was harassing him. That I was making false claims. That I was mentally unstable. Her voice stayed even. He has a file on us, too. I figured that out after the 3rd time the police called me about my behavior instead of his. The precision of the manipulation she was describing made the room settle differently. This wasn't a person operating on instinct or impulse. This was a person who understood systems well enough to use them in both directions simultaneously, not just avoiding consequences, but actively generating counter-narratives that preemptively undermined the people trying to pursue him. He has help, Hatch said. He'd come back in while Ryder was watching Avery by the stove. Sometime in the last 20 minutes, quiet entry, the habit of old law enforcement, and was standing near the door with his own coffee and a look that said he'd been thinking since he left and had arrived at something. What kind of help? Voss said. She was back. Ryder hadn't heard her arrive either. She'd come through the back. She had a key from the fraud investigation 3 years ago that technically should have been returned and that Ryder had never asked for back. She was holding a manila folder, thin, with the bearing of a woman who has slept approximately 90 minutes and has decided to treat that as sufficient. I made my calls, she said. Sit down, everyone, all of you. The shop gathered, Mackie and Delt on the workbench, Hatch by the door, Ryder on the stool. Danielle standing near the stove where she could see Avery, who had climbed onto the bike display stand and was examining the chrome on a 98 Softail with focused appreciation. Voss opened the folder. The name Danielle gave us appears in the state database twice. Once as a witness in a 2019 civil case, and once as a person of interest in a 2021 missing persons investigation that was, in the words of the transfer notation, resolved through alternate jurisdiction. She looked up. There is no corresponding record of what that alternate jurisdiction was or what resolution means in this context. The case simply ends. Somebody deleted the outcome, Mackie said. Somebody reclassified the outcome, Voss said, which is different legally and harder to trace. Deletion leaves absence. Reclassification leaves something that looks like presence. You have to know what you're looking for to see that it's wrong. And you know what you're looking for, Ryder said. I do now. She turned a page. There is a former county official in Harlow's administrative history, semi-retired, still maintains advisory relationships with 3 county departments, including, and this is the piece I need you to hear clearly, the Records Management Division that oversees case transfer requests. The room absorbed that. Name? Ryder asked. Voss looked at him. In the quality of that look, the particular weight of it, the way her eyes held his for exactly 1 beat longer than informational delivery required, he felt something shift in his sternum. Old stone moving again, deeper this time, the way things move before they break loose. Warren Cole, she said. The name fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Ryder heard it with his whole body, not the way you hear information, but the way you hear a sound that means the ground has changed underneath you. He heard Mackie inhale sharply from the workbench. He heard Delt go very still. The particular stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react visibly to things that require an internal reaction. Warren Cole, his uncle, his father's older brother. The man who had appeared at every family gathering of Ryder's childhood with the easy authority of someone the community respected. A county administrator for 22 years, a man who attended town meetings and coached Little League for a single season and had photographs on his office wall of himself shaking hands with people who held offices. A man who had sat across a kitchen table from Ryder at the age of 8 and told him that being strong meant never asking for help, because asking for help was what weak people did. A man who had been in the room, peripherally, when Carla had first started trying to tell people what was happening to her. A man who had told Ryder at the time, quietly, carefully, that his sister was going through a difficult period and that the most helpful thing Ryder could do was give her space to work through it rather than escalating her distress by taking her claims too literally. Ryder's hands were very still on his knees. He became aware that everyone in the room was watching him. Not obviously. They were all looking at slightly different angles, the way people look when they're watching someone without wanting to be seen doing it. Delt had shifted, almost imperceptibly, approximately 6 inches closer. "Ryder," Voss said carefully, "I heard you. You know who that is?" "Yes." "I need to know how you're—" "I heard you," he said again. Same tone, same flatness. The voice he used when the thing happening inside him was loud enough that everything outside him had to be very quiet. He stood up from the stool. He walked to the side window and looked at the alley, which was empty now, wet and silent in the thin morning light. A tire track from the truck, still visible in the standing water at the near end, already beginning to disperse. He thought about his sister. He thought about Warren Cole sitting at a kitchen table telling him to give Carla space. He thought about every missing report, every reclassified case, every woman who had documented 68 pages of evidence and been told to wait while somewhere in the administrative background of a county system, a man with advisor access and political currency made quiet phone calls that made cases stop moving forward. He turned around. The shop was waiting. Delt's eyes, Mackey's jaw, Hatch's careful stillness, Voss's steady, uninflected watch. Danielle Quinn standing near the stove with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she'd stopped drinking from, looking at him with an expression he finally understood. Not the expression of someone who needed saving, but the expression of someone who had been right all along about something unbearable and was waiting to see if this time, this one time, the person in front of her was going to believe her without needing 3 more months of documentation. "Tell me," Ryder said to Voss, "what we need to build a case that nobody can reclassify." Voss opened to the next page. "We need physical evidence from a location that's been in the Cole family for 20 years, she said. An abandoned farm property in the eastern county. It appears in 2 of the case files I pulled as an address given voluntarily by persons of interest who were never followed up on." She looked at him. "I need to know if you have access to it." Ryder looked at her. He knew the farm. He'd known it since he was 12 years old, when his uncle had taken him there for a single weekend that he'd filed away in the back of his memory as unremarkable. A cold property, a broken barn, a stretch of land that his uncle had described as an investment he was holding. He'd never thought about it again. Until right now. "I know where it is," Ryder said, and the moment he said it, he understood that whatever control he'd maintained over the shape of this situation had just ended. Not because he'd lost control, but because the situation had finally revealed its actual size, and the size of it was not a stalker in a truck and a frightened woman and a child running through the rain. The size of it was years, decades. A system built inside the walls of his own family. And somewhere inside that system, in a silence that had been mistaken for resolution, there might still be people who hadn't. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds after Ryder said it. The shop held its breath, the stove ticking, the fluorescent light above the tool rack still flickering in its broken rhythm, the wet morning pressing against the windows. And in those 3 seconds, every person in the room was doing a private calculation, running the same numbers through different emotional frameworks and arriving at the same destination from different directions. Ryder knew the farm, which meant Ryder was inside this in a way that none of them had understood 2 minutes ago. Voss spoke first because Voss was the one in the room most practiced at moving through revelation without letting it slow her down. "How well do you know the property?" "Well enough," Ryder's voice came from somewhere behind his sternum, flat and controlled in the specific way that meant everything underneath it was the opposite of flat and controlled. I was there once, 26 years ago. My uncle took me there for a weekend in November, said he was showing me the land. He paused. Old barn. Farmhouse with a broken foundation. Maybe 40 acres, mostly scrub. The eastern edge runs along a creek that floods every spring. What's the access road? Off County Route 9. Unmarked. You'd miss it if you didn't know to look. Boss wrote something in the margin of her folder. Have you been back since? No? Has anyone from your family mentioned it in recent years? Ryder thought about that. About the particular texture of his relationship with Warren Cole over the last decade. The gradual thinning of it. The holiday appearances that had become shorter and more perfunctory. The way Warren had aged into a kind of benign civic gravity that nobody thought to question because respectable men of a certain age become part of the furniture of a community, background infrastructure you stop examining because it's always been there. No, Ryder said. He never mentioned it, he paused, which I'm now understanding differently than I did this morning. Danielle Quinn set her coffee cup down on the edge of the workbench with a small, careful click. This man, she said, Warren Cole. He was connected to the person who was following us before Gavin. You're telling me your uncle was the mechanism, the person who killed the cases. I'm telling you his name appears in the file, Voss said. She said it carefully, the careful calibration of law enforcement language, but her eyes went to Ryder as she said it, and the look in them was not the look of someone who thought the connection was coincidental. It's not just a name in a file, Ryder said. He said it to Voss, but he was looking at Danielle when he said it, because Danielle was the one in the room who had earned the truth most. He told me to ignore my sister. The sentence fell out of him quietly, without drama, without the emotional preparation that such sentences usually require. He heard Mackie go still at the workbench, heard Delt shift his weight on the other side of the room. Danielle didn't look away from him. Your sister, she said. Carla. She was 9 years younger than me. She tried to tell me something was happening. He stopped, found the word he needed and discarded it and found a different one. Someone had access to her, had been having access to her for a long time, in a way she couldn't articulate clearly because she'd been young when it started and didn't have the language. He looked at the floor once, then back up. She came to me when she was 22. I was 29. Warren was at the table when she first mentioned it. Not the full thing, just the edge of it. A moment at a family dinner where she said something that should have stopped everyone in the room. And Warren told you to give her space, Hatch said, quietly. Like a man who had seen this shape before and was confirming coordinates. He said she was going through something, said she needed stability, not escalation, said if we pushed her, it would make things worse. Ryder's jaw was very tight. I believed him. He was the adult in the room. He was the person who knew how systems worked. He was the person I'd been taught to trust on matters of... He stopped again. On matters of what was real and what wasn't. The word real hung in the room like something that had weight and gravity. Avery, from her position on the bike display stand, had gone very still. She was no longer examining the chrome. She was listening with the absolute attention of a child who has learned that adult conversations contain information she needs and who has stopped performing unawareness because the pretense costs too much. Danielle looked at her daughter. A silent negotiation passed between them. Danielle's eyes asking a question, Avery's slight tilt of the head answering it. And Danielle walked to the stand and helped Avery down and said something quietly, and Avery went back to the office without argument. She was old enough to know what she'd heard, old enough to know when she'd been protected from hearing more. The door closed. Danielle turned back to the room. Carla, she said. Where is she now? Ryder looked at her directly. I don't know. The two words landed like a diagnosis. Voss turned another page in her folder with a movement that was too deliberate, too controlled, and Ryder recognized it as the movement of a person who is managing the revelation of information she's been sitting on for longer than she's revealed. He'd worked with enough investigators to know that posture. She was timing something. Voss, he said. She looked up. What else is in the folder? A pause. 1 second, 2. She closed the folder, which was itself a kind of answer. The Tessa Aldrich case, she said. The one Hatch worked. When it was transferred to state jurisdiction 8 months ago, it was absorbed into a larger investigation involving multiple missing persons cases across 4 counties. She met his eyes. There are 7 names in that investigation. 7 women who went missing over a period of 11 years, all of whom had documented connections to the same overlapping network of addresses, persons of interest, and, in 3 cases, the same county administrative override pattern that killed their cases. 7, Mackey said. 7 confirmed. There may be more that we haven't connected yet. Delt spoke from across the room, his voice carrying the tight, compressed quality of a man maintaining clinical distance from something personal. Where are they? 2 were found, 1 alive, 1 not. Voss paused. The other 5 are still classified as missing. The state investigation has been running for 8 months and hasn't produced an arrest because they haven't been able to identify the physical location where... She stopped, chose her words. Where the activity was centered. The activity. The room understood what she meant, and nobody said it out loud because saying it out loud would have changed something in the air of the shop that none of them were ready to change yet. The farm, Hatch said. It's a candidate, Voss said. We have circumstantial geographic overlap. The Eastern County land records show the property in question has been in the Cole family since 1987 and has never been sold, transferred, or listed. It pays minimal property tax, small enough to go unnoticed in a county budget, but enough to maintain legal standing. She opened the folder again to a specific page. The address has appeared twice in voluntary statements from persons of interest who were interviewed and released. In both cases, the interviewing officer noted the address, and then the follow-up visit never happened. Because the follow-up request went through records management, Ryder said. That's my assessment, yes. Ryder stood up from the stool. He walked the length of the shop, not pacing, just moving, because his body needed to be in motion to process what his mind was processing, and ended up near the front window, looking at the empty street. The morning had gone to the color of old pewter, flat and cold, the kind of gray that felt like it had intention. He thought about Warren Cole's hands, the specific memory of them, wide, with thick fingers, the hands of a man who had done manual labor in his youth before transitioning to administrative work, always slightly too warm when they gripped your shoulder. The way he'd gripped Ryder's shoulder the day Ryder left for basic training and said something about strength and sacrifice that had sounded profound at 20 and sounded like something else entirely at 38. He turned around. I need to see the farm, he said. Ryder, Delt started. Not to touch anything, not to confront anyone. He said it to Delt first because Delt was the one who needed to hear the parameters. To look, to confirm what Voss has, and give her something concrete enough to get a warrant. That's not how warrants work, Voss said. Then tell me how they work, and I'll do it that way. A civilian walking onto that property compromises any evidence collected subsequently. If we're going to build something that holds in court, we need 48 hours, Ryder said. You said 48 hours. I said I needed 48 hours to make calls. You've made them. The clock started when you walked back through that door. He looked at her steadily. What's the fastest path to a legal search of that property? Voss looked at him for a long moment, and in the look was the particular calculation of a person weighing what is right against what is possible, against what will actually work in the time available, against the background of a system that has already demonstrated its willingness to move paperwork faster than justice. A credible witness statement placing specific activity at that address, she said finally. Someone with direct knowledge, not circumstantial overlap. She paused. Someone who was there. Hatch straightened against the wall. They all understood what that meant, and who might qualify. Warren Cole was not the kind of man you walked up to and asked directly. Ryder understood that with the clarity of someone who had known the man for 38 years. Warren was the kind of man who had built his entire operational architecture around never being the person who did anything directly. Always the removed hand, always the administrative buffer, always the person who made the phone call that made the other person make the decision that produced the outcome Warren wanted without Warren's fingerprints on any of the intermediate steps. To get Warren to say something directly, You needed to put him in a situation where the indirect architecture had already collapsed around him, where he believed the game was already over, where the choice was between admitting a contained version of the truth and being consumed by the larger version of it, which meant someone had to show Warren Cole that they already knew. No, Mackey said. He said it before Ryder spoke, because Mackey had known Ryder long enough to read the shape of what he was about to propose from the angle of his shoulders. Absolutely not. I haven't said anything. You were about to say you should be the one to approach him. I'm the only one he'll talk to. He's not going to talk to you. He's going to lawyer up in 40 seconds and spend the next 6 months making your life impossible through every administrative mechanism he has access to. Mackey came off the workbench and crossed to Ryder, close enough to make the conversation exclusive without lowering his voice enough to seem like he was hiding it. You're not a cop. You're not a lawyer. You're the man's nephew, which means anything you pull out of him is either inadmissible or a personal conversation, and either way, it doesn't give Voss what she needs. It might give us the farm, Ryder said. If he thinks we already have enough, he might try to clean something, move, and that movement is something Voss can document. That's a gamble? Everything from this point forward is a gamble. Mackey held his ground. There are 5 women still missing. I know. And your uncle might know where they are. I know that too. Ryder's voice had gone very quiet. That's why I'm not going to wait 48 hours for the system to get around to asking him. Delt had moved across the room during this exchange, positioning himself in the specific way that medics position themselves in volatile situations, not between the combatants, but at a 45-degree angle, equidistant, available to go in either direction. Ryder noticed it and felt something shift in his chest that was not quite irritation and not quite gratitude and might have been both. Ryder. Delt's voice was its medic voice, not soft, not hard, just level, carrying the calibrated tone of a man who needed the person in front of him to hear clearly. If you go at Warren Cole alone and he shuts down and the administrative system responds before we can get a warrant, those 5 women might stay where they are long enough that... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ryder looked at him. I know, he said, for the 3rd time. Each time it had meant something different. Voss put her folder under her arm. There is one option, she said, that doesn't require any of you to contact Warren Cole directly. The room waited. The state investigation has a contact, someone I trust. If I give them the farm address as a geographically specific lead supported by 2 documented case overlaps and a credible source, Hatch's prior case notes and Danielle's file, they may be able to move on a property access authorization faster than a standard warrant. How fast? Hatch asked. 6 to 12 hours if the contact moves it up the right channel. And if Warren Cole moves first? Then we have a different problem. She looked at each of them in turn. Which is why I need every person in this room to be somewhere visible and documented for the next 6 hours. Nothing that looks like preparation, nothing that looks like movement toward the property. If Warren Cole has access to the same administrative monitoring that killed those cases, he may have visibility into our response patterns. You think he's watching us, Mackey said. I think he's been watching this situation since a dark blue truck parked in an alley last night and documented Avery Quinn running to this address. She paused. I think he knows exactly where his exposure is. Then he knows Ryder's involved, Delt said. Yes. Delt looked at Ryder. Which means he's going to make contact. He's going to make contact, Voss agreed. And when he does, I need Ryder to let me know immediately and do nothing until I give the word. She looked at Ryder with the full, undeflected weight of her professional authority, which was considerable, and underneath the authority was something else, a concern that was not entirely procedural, the look of a person who suspected she was asking for something that the man in front of her might not be able to deliver. Can you do that? She asked. Ryder looked at her. He thought about his sister's voice at 22, trying to tell him something at a kitchen table while Warren Cole sat 3 feet away and radiated calm authority. He thought about the 8 months since Carla's last contact, which had become a year, which had become 9 years of silence that he told himself was her choice, and had never fully believed was her choice, but had not had the courage to pursue with the ferocity it deserved. Yes, he said. He meant it. He meant it the way you mean something when you are holding a much larger intention inside the smaller one, when the yes is real, but is also the outer wall of something that will only be revealed by what happens next. Voss either believed him or decided to act as if she did, which amounted to the same operational result. She left. Hatch left 20 minutes later, going to pull his personal case files from the storage unit where he kept the records from his deputy years, the ones he'd made copies of before turning in his badge. An act of low-level insubordination that had felt neurotic at the time and now felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. The shop exhaled. Danielle came to where Ryder stood near the workbench. "Your sister's name is Carla," she said. "Yes." "When's the last time you heard from her?" 9 years ago, a voicemail. She said she was moving and she'd give me a new number when she was settled." He paused. "She never did." Danielle absorbed that without filling it with the condolences that most people reflexively offered. Instead, she said, "When Avery was 7, she found me on the bathroom floor. I'd been in there for 2 hours trying to figure out how to be okay enough to make her dinner. She knocked on the door and said, 'Mom, the mac and cheese is already in the pot from yesterday. I can turn on the stove if you tell me how.' She looked at the closed office door. She has never once expected me to be more than I was. She just kept solving the next problem." Ryder looked at the same door. "She's going to be okay," Danielle said. "Whatever happens with all of this, she's going to be okay because she's already figured out how to be." "She shouldn't have had to figure that out at 10, Ryder said. "No," Danielle agreed. "She shouldn't have." They stood there for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have been forced into each other's proximity by circumstances larger than either of them, and have discovered in the process that they are not strangers in the ways that matter. The phone call came at 10:14 in the morning. Ryder's cell. Number he didn't recognize. Local area code, landline prefix. He looked at it for 2 rings, then answered. "Ryder?" Warren Cole's voice. 71 years old and still carrying the particular resonance of a man who had spent decades in rooms where he was the loudest authority. Measured, warm, at the surface. "I heard you had some excitement last night." Ryder said nothing. "A young woman and her daughter, I understand, came to the shop in some distress." A pause calibrated to feel like concern. "Small town. Word gets around." "Does it?" Ryder said. "I wanted to check in, make sure you're all right. Things like that can be unsettling when you're not prepared for them." Another pause. "I also wanted to offer some context. The situation involving that family is more complicated than it might appear. There are mental health components that make it difficult to assess what's accurate and what isn't." Ryder felt the cold come up through his boots from the concrete floor, felt it spread up his legs and into his hands. His grip on the phone was very still. "I see," he said. "I know it's hard when someone comes to you in a state like that not to take everything at face value. You've always had that instinct, to protect. It's one of your strongest qualities." Warren's voice carried something that in other circumstances would have sounded like pride. But sometimes the most protective thing is to step back and let the people with the full picture handle it. "The people with the full picture," Ryder said. "Professionals, counselors, the appropriate authorities." A slight softening of the voice. "I have some contacts who work with families in crisis, people who can make sure the right support is in place. If you'd like, I can make some calls on your behalf." Ryder thought about Voss, about her instruction, about the 6 to 12 hours. He thought about 5 names in a file. "I appreciate that," he said. His voice was a locked room. "Let me think about it." "Of course." Warren's warmth was a practiced thing, smooth as riverstone. "Take your time, and Ryder, it might be worth keeping things quiet for now, until the situation is properly assessed. You don't want to get caught up in something that turns out to be different than it appeared." There it was. The warning wrapped in concern, the threat in the shape of advice. "I'll keep that in mind," Ryder said. "Good." A pause. "How's the shop?" "Fine." "Good. That's good." The voice of a man satisfied with the architecture of the conversation he'd just built. "I'll be in touch." He hung up. Ryder put the phone down on the workbench slowly. He became aware that Mackie and Delt were both looking at him. They'd heard the tone of the conversation without hearing the words. Warren, Mackey said. Not a question. He offered to make calls on my behalf, Ryder said, to handle the situation. Delt's eyes went flat. He's going to move. He's going to move fast. Ryder picked the phone back up and called Voss. She answered in one ring. I heard from him, Ryder said. It's been less than 4 hours. He's not waiting to see what we do. I know, Voss said. Something in her voice had changed from 2 hours ago, a tightness. Ryder, I need you to listen to me carefully. My contact at the state level. When I gave them the farm address, they ran it through the active case database. A pause. The farm appears in the existing investigation, not as a candidate location, as a confirmed address that was identified 6 months ago, and then the action on it was paused. Ryder's hand on the phone went white at the knuckle. Paused. How? An administrative hold. Origin of the hold is listed as pending jurisdictional review. Another pause. The review was never completed. The hold is still active. Someone stopped the investigation of the farm 6 months ago. Yes. And kept it stopped. Yes. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the careful, controlled breathing of a woman who is managing the weight of what she'd found. Is my uncle's name on the hold? He asked. Not directly. A pause that told him everything before the words did. But the request for the jurisdictional review was made by a county advisory board member with records access. The request is signed with an advisory board stamp, not an individual signature. A board he sits on. A board he chairs. The concrete floor was cold all the way up to Ryder's jaw now. Voss, he said, the state investigation, the 5 women still missing. Do they have any active leads on physical location? The pause was long enough that it stopped feeling like hesitation and started feeling like preparation. Before this morning, no, she said. But my contact pulled the full case file when I gave them the farm address. A breath. Ryder, there's something in the file you need to know, something I should have told you earlier, but I needed to confirm it before. Tell me now. Another breath. One of the 7 names in the state investigation, she said. One of the women who went missing. She matches the descriptors you gave me for your sister. The world went very quiet. The name in the file isn't Carla Cole, Voss said. She would have changed it, likely. That would be consistent with someone trying to disappear from a situation before they understood the full size of what they were disappearing from. A pause. But the age, the physical description, the last known location, the timeline. Another pause. It matches, Ryder. All of it matches. He was sitting down. He didn't remember sitting down. The stool was under him and his hands were on his knees and the phone was still at his ear and the shop around him had the particular quality of a place that has become very still very suddenly. Mackey, 2 feet away, not speaking, not moving, Delt already crossing toward him from the far wall. She's one of the 5, Ryder said. His voice sounded like someone else's voice heard through a wall. We don't have confirmation, Voss said carefully. We have strong indicators. But Ryder, is she alive? The pause. The specific, devastating length of it. We don't know, Voss said. The investigation has no confirmed status on any of the 5 missing women. That's why we need the farm. Her voice shifted into something harder, more urgent. And that is why I am telling you that I am calling my contact right now and asking them to move the property access authorization to the top of the stack. And why I am asking you, Ryder, I need you to hear me. I need you to stay in that shop. Whatever you're thinking right now, whatever your body is telling you to do, I need you to stay in that shop until I call you back. He heard her. He heard every word. He held the phone against his ear and looked at the oil-stained concrete floor and felt Delt's hand land on his shoulder with the particular weight of someone who has placed their hand on people in the worst moments of their lives and knows exactly how much pressure to use. How long? Ryder asked. 2 hours, maybe less. Ryder, 2 hours, he said. He hung up. Delt's hand stayed on his shoulder. Mackey crouched down in front of him, the way Delt had crouched in front of Avery the night before, putting himself at eye level, and looked at Ryder with the compressed, layered face that had stopped being easy to read 20 years ago, and that Ryder could read perfectly right now. Tell us, Mackie said. Ryder told them. When he finished, the shop was so quiet that the fluorescent light above the tool rack seemed louder. Its irregular flickering a kind of noise, the sound of something on the edge of failing that hadn't failed yet. Delt took his hand off Ryder's shoulder. He walked to the far wall and stood there for a moment with his back to the room, the posture of a man doing something internal that required privacy. His shoulders moved once, not a sob, not a shudder, just a single controlled breath that went through his whole body. Then he turned around. His face was the medic face, fully engaged, all the private responses filed behind the thing that needed to happen next. "Mackie," he said, "call the others." Mackie was already on his phone. Ryder sat on the stool with his hands on his knees and looked at the side window, at the empty alley, at the tire track and the standing water that was almost gone now, dispersed into the ordinary wet of an ordinary February morning. He thought about Carla at 22. The way she'd looked at him across the kitchen table when she'd said the thing she'd said, the edge of it, the beginning of it. And the way Warren Cole's warm, authoritative voice had wrapped around the room and somehow made the edge disappear, made the table feel like a normal table at a normal family dinner, and not a place where his sister had just tried to hand him the most important information of both their lives. He'd let that happen. He'd let it happen because he'd trusted the architecture of the room more than the voice of the person in it. He would not make that mistake again. An hour and 40 minutes later, when Voss called back and her voice came through the phone with a new quality in it, not relief, not urgency, something between them that had no clean name, Ryder was already standing. He'd been standing for 20 minutes. His jacket was on. His keys were in his hand. Mackie and Delt were at the door. Outside, he could hear the sound he'd been listening for, the low, steady rumble of Harleys coming in from the east end of Baker Alley, the sound of men who had answered a phone call and not asked unnecessary questions, who had loaded themselves onto their bikes in the February cold and come. "The authorization came through," Voss said. "State investigators are staging 40 minutes out. They want us there when they make entry." A pause. "All of you, on record, as the parties who identified the location." "We'll be there," Ryder said. "Ryder," her voice stopped him. "Whatever we find at that farm, I know. You need to be prepared for Voss." He said her name the way you say something when you need it to function as a full stop. "I've been not prepared for 9 years. I'm done not being prepared." He put the phone in his pocket. He walked through the shop and out the front door and into the February cold. And his Harley was exactly where he'd left it, patient and indifferent, the way machines are patient and indifferent. And he put his leg over it and felt the familiar geometry of it settle around him, and put his key in and turned it, and felt the engine come alive beneath him with the particular low thunder that he'd been living inside for 15 years. The sound that meant forward, the sound that meant regardless. Behind him, engines answered, 1, then 2, then 4, then more. The sound of them together in the cold morning air was not the sound of an army and not the sound of a mob. It was something else, the sound of men who had all, in their separate ways, been failed by the structures that were supposed to make the world navigable, who had built something smaller and more honest in the space left by that failure, and who were now pointed in the same direction for the same reason. Avery was watching from the shop window. He saw her face as he pulled out, small, serious, her breath fogging the cold glass. He didn't wave, she didn't wave either. She just watched, with those ancient patient eyes that had seen too much and were watching to see if this time the outcome would be different. He owed her a different outcome. He owed Carla one too. 40 years too late, maybe. Or not. That was the thing about the farm, about what might or might not be inside it, about the 5 names in a state file and the particular match of age and description and last known location that Voss had laid across his chest like something cold. It might be too late, or it might not be, and he wouldn't know until he got there. And the only thing he could do with that uncertainty was ride toward it instead of away from it, which was the only real choice he'd ever had in anything that mattered. County Route 9 opened up ahead of him, gray and wet and stretching east toward a piece of land his uncle had shown him once when he was 12 years old and described as County Route 9 ran east like a scar. Ryder held the throttle steady at 60 and felt the cold come through his jacket in sheets. The February air finding every seam, every worn patch of leather, every place where the body underneath was not prepared for it. The road was wet from the night's rain, but the sky had gone pale and hard, the clouds thinning to the kind of high gray that gave light without warmth, the kind of morning that looked like clarity and felt like exposure. Behind him he could hear them. Not individual engines anymore, but the collective sound. 6 bikes running tight formation on a 2-lane county road, the bass frequency of it traveling through the asphalt and up through the frame and into his bones. The sound that had become, over 6 years, the closest thing he had to a language for not being alone. Mackie was directly behind him. Delt behind Mackie. Hatch on the outside flank. The others, Briggs, who ran the cold storage out on Franklin and had done 2 tours in Fallujah and never talked about either. Cord, 29 years old and the newest of them, a former MP with hands that shook sometimes in the morning for reasons he didn't explain and didn't need to. All of them present, all of them pointed east. Voss was ahead. Her sedan visible a quarter-mile out, moving at the same speed, her hazards off because they were not advertising this approach to anyone who might be watching a county road at 9 in the morning. Ryder's left shoulder was screaming. He'd been on the bike for 31 minutes, and the cold and the tension had conspired to work the old injury into a grinding, deep complaint that traveled from his shoulder socket down to his elbow and manifested as a specific heat that was the opposite of warmth. He adjusted his grip once. The shoulder did not adjust with him. He accepted that and rode. The unmarked turn off Route 9 came up faster than he expected. His memory of the place was a child's memory, scaled wrong. The distances shorter than they'd felt at 12. The geography compressed by the intervening years into something he'd half believed he'd misremembered. But the turn was there. A gap in the tree line on the right, a dirt track that had been gravel once and had reverted to something older and less intentional, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles side by side. Voss turned without signaling. She'd been here before, or she'd mapped it carefully. Either was possible with Voss. Ryder followed. The track ran through a tunnel of bare trees for approximately a quarter mile, the branches close enough overhead that even leafless they reduced the pale sky to a series of fragments. The ground was soft here, the rain having saturated the dirt, and the bikes moved through it with more care, slower, the engines dropping to a steadier, lower note. Mud kicked up from the front tire and hit Ryder's leg. He felt it and didn't look down. Then the trees opened. The farmhouse came first. 2 stories, white paint gone to gray, and then to almost nothing. The kind of building that had stopped resisting its own decay at some point and was now simply waiting. The front porch had partially collapsed on the left side. Every window on the ground floor was boarded, the plywood weathered to the same gray as the siding, the boards fitted with the precision of someone who had intended them to stay. This was not the casual boarding of an abandoned property. This was deliberate. This was maintenance. The barn was to the right, further back, separated from the house by a concrete apron that had heaved and cracked through multiple freeze-thaw cycles until it looked like something broken and then refrozen. The barn was larger than Ryder remembered, or he'd remembered it small because he'd been small. A structure that had once been red and was now the color of old rust, the boards vertical and close-fitted. The main doors closed with a chain and padlock that were visibly newer than anything else on the property. New chain, new lock, on an abandoned property. Voss's sedan had stopped 20 yards from the farmhouse. She was out of it before Ryder had his kickstand down, moving toward the 2 state investigator vehicles that were already parked along the tree line. He hadn't seen them until now, their dark colors absorbed against the bare trees, positioned with the deliberate invisibility of people who had been here longer than the new arrivals. Ryder killed his engine. The silence after the engine stopped was enormous. It pressed against him like something physical. The particular silence of a place that had not had ordinary human activity in a long time. A silence that was not peaceful but accumulated. The silence of absence that went back years. His boots hit the mud. Mackie was beside him in seconds, Delt a step behind. State has a forensic unit staged on Route 9, Voss said when Ryder reached her. She was speaking quickly, precisely, the full professional focus of her engaged now with no social layer over it. They move in after the investigators clear the structure. We have authorization to be present as consulting parties, but we do not enter until the structure is cleared. She looked at each of them in turn, the look landing last and longest on Ryder. That is not a suggestion. Understood, Ryder said. She held the look for one extra second, reading something in his face that she apparently decided to accept, and turned back to the lead investigator, a tall woman in her 50s named Deacon's county credentials, state task force jacket, with the particular economy of movement of someone who'd been doing this long enough that she'd eliminated everything unnecessary. Deacons looked at Ryder. You're Cole. Yes. The advisory board member, Warren Cole. Relation? Uncle. Deacon's face didn't change. You have direct knowledge of this property. I was here once, 26 years ago. I know the layout from memory, to the extent a 12-year-old's memory is reliable. Walk me through it. He walked her through it. The farmhouse, main floor, kitchen at the back, 2 rooms on either side of the central hall, staircase to the right of the entrance, the upper floor with 3 rooms that he remembered as empty and dust-sheeted. The barn. Single large open space, a tack room at the far end, a partial loft that had been unusable even then, a concrete pad along the back wall that he thought was for equipment storage. When he said concrete pad, Deacon's eyes sharpened by 1 degree. Below grade? She asked. There was a step down, Ryder said. He heard his own voice saying it and heard the implication catching up to the fact a half-second later, the way terrible understandings always arrived slightly after the information that triggered them. Maybe 18 inches below the main floor level. Deacons turned to her team without another word. They moved toward the barn. Ryder stood in the mud of the concrete apron and watched them go. His hands were at his sides, very still. Mackie stood next to him close enough that their jacket sleeves touched, which was as much contact as either of them did. The new lock, Mackie said quietly. Yeah. Someone's been here recently. Yeah. The lock had been cut before the investigators reached it. Someone on the team had bolt cutters and used them with the practiced speed of someone who'd done it many times. The chain came off. The main doors swung out with the particular groan of large hinges that were cold and resistant. The investigators went in. The wait was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Ryder counted. Then Deacons came back out and walked directly to Voss and spoke to her quietly, too quietly for Ryder to hear from where he stood. He watched Voss's face during whatever was being said, watched the specific series of micro-expressions that moved through it. Not shock, because Voss was past shock, but something harder, something that was confirmation landing on top of long suspicion, the particular weight of being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. Voss looked at Ryder. She said, Come. He went. The barn smelled of cold and wet wood and something else underneath it, chemical and sharp and wrong. The smell of a place that had been cleaned many times but not cleanly enough. The smell of things that cleaning cannot fully address. Ryder's body recognized it before his mind named it, and he felt the recognition as a physical response, a specific, involuntary tightening of his entire system, the ancient animal response to wrongness. The main floor of the barn was largely empty, some old equipment covered by tarps, a workbench along the left wall with tools arranged on it, with a neatness that was at odds with the apparent abandonment of the property, a space heater in the corner, not running now, but plugged in. Extension cord running from it to a generator that was positioned near the side door, relatively new, a 20-gallon fuel can beside it. They were maintaining temperature in here. Ryder looked at the concrete pad at the back. The step down, 18 inches, as he'd remembered, led to a section of the barn floor that was, on examination, a second layer. A concrete floor poured over the original, newer than the walls around it, with a drainage channel cut into its center that ran to a metal grate in the far corner. Along the back wall of this lower section, set into the concrete at intervals, were 4 steel door frames, each fitted with a heavy steel door, each locked from the outside with a bolt and padlock. 4 doors. Ryder stopped walking. He stood on the step down and looked at the 4 doors and felt the world he had constructed around himself over the last 9 years. The shop, the brothers, the careful management of what he allowed himself to feel and pursue and believe. compress into something very small and very dense in the center of his chest. "How many?" he asked. His voice was a locked room. He didn't recognize it as his own. "We don't know yet," Deacon said from behind him. "The locks." "Cut them," Ryder said. "We have a process." "Cut them now. Mr. Cole, cut them." Not loud, not aggressive. The specific flatness of someone whose capacity for institutional patience has been surgically removed by circumstance. Deacons looked at Voss. Voss looked at Ryder. Something passed between them. Not permission, because Voss didn't give permission for things outside her jurisdiction, but an acknowledgement, a recognition of what was being asked and why. She gave Deacons one small nod. The bolt cutters came out again. The first door opened on an empty space. A room approximately 8 feet by 10, concrete walls, concrete floor, a drain, a bare mattress on a metal frame, a bucket, and nothing else. The mattress had been used, recently enough that the indentation in it had not fully recovered. Empty. The second door opened. Also empty. Same configuration, same mattress. On the wall near the door at approximately shoulder height, a series of scratch marks had been cut into the concrete with something small, a key, maybe, or a piece of wire. Ryder looked at them. 7 rows of 5 and 1 row of 3. 38 marks. 38 days. He stepped back. The third door. The investigators opened it, and the woman inside made a sound. Not a scream, something lower and more broken than a scream. The sound of a person whose body reacted to a door opening before her mind could assess what the opening meant. She was in the corner, as far from the door as the room allowed, a posture that had become so habitual that it looked structural. She was in her 30s, dark hair, unwashed, a bruise along her left jaw and the yellow-green of something 10 days old. Her eyes, when they adjusted to the light from the barn, more light than the bare bulb inside had provided, went through a sequence. Terror, then assessment, then a kind of suspended disbelief that was itself a form of hope she didn't dare complete. Delt was inside the room before anyone else responded. He moved the way he moved when it mattered. No excess, no hesitation, crouching immediately to her level, putting himself physically smaller than her so the geometry of the space gave her the power, his voice going to the particular register he used in field situations. Ryder couldn't hear what he was saying. He could see the woman's breathing, rapid, shallow, the breathing of someone in sustained stress, begin to change incrementally. "Tessa," Voss said quietly from behind Ryder. "Tessa Aldrich." Hatch made a sound, a single, raw sound that he cut off immediately, but that had already been heard by everyone in the barn. "Tessa Aldrich. Not missing. Here." 38 marks on a wall. The fourth door. Ryder's legs carried him to it without a conscious instruction to move. He was aware of Voss saying his name, but the sound of it was coming from somewhere with distance between them. His hand was on the bolt before Deacons reached him. "Wait," Deacon said. "I can't wait," Ryder said. "We don't know—" "I know," he said, and pulled the bolt. The door opened inward. The room was dark. The bare bulb inside had burned out, unlike the others, and for 2 full seconds he could see nothing. His eyes adjusted. The mattress. The same metal frame. The drain. The walls. A figure in the corner, smaller than he expected, or smaller than the version of her he'd been carrying. His sister at 22, the age at which he'd last had a real image of her, and the woman in the corner was 31, or looked 31, though the last 9 years could have made her look older. She was upright. She was sitting upright against the wall with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and her face angled slightly toward the door, as if she'd heard the bolts on the other doors being cut and had been waiting, not daring to move, processing the sounds without interpreting them, because interpretation cost hope, and hope was the thing that hurt most. "Carla," Ryder said. His voice broke on the second syllable. Just slightly, just enough. The woman's head came up. Her face in the dim light, older, yes, changed in the specific way that 9 years of fear changes people. The watchfulness, written permanently into the lines of it, was the face he'd carried for 9 years in the locked place in his chest. The face he'd told himself was fine, had moved voluntarily, had chosen silence. Ryder, she said. Just his name. Just the one word. Like a person who has said a word so many times in a space where no one could hear it, that saying it aloud to someone who could hear it required everything she had. He crossed the room in 2 steps and went to his knees on the concrete in front of her and put his arms around her, and she held on with both hands and made no sound. None. Just held on with a grip that told him everything about the 9 years. How long they'd been, how heavy. How she'd survived them by contracting into something very small and very dense, and extremely unwilling to let go of whatever it finally found to hold. He held her. The concrete floor was cold through his knees. His shoulder was burning. He didn't move. Behind him, in the barn, he could hear Delt talking to Tessa Aldrich. He could hear Deacons on a radio, requesting the forensic unit to advance. He could hear Mackey's boots on the concrete step, stopping, giving them space. He could hear, faintly, the sound of birds starting in the trees at the edge of the property. The ordinary, indifferent sound of a winter morning proceeding regardless. I didn't stop looking, he said into his sister's hair. It wasn't entirely true, and he knew it, and she probably knew it, and it didn't matter right now. What mattered was the version of it that was true. That he was here, that the looking had eventually produced this room, that the room was opening rather than staying closed. I know, Carla said. I know you didn't. She said it with a generosity that cost her something, and he felt the cost of it and carried it. He heard the radio crackle, heard Deacon's voice change, the professional elevation of a person receiving information that changes the operational picture. He pulled back slightly from Carla, not letting go, and looked at her face in the dim light. Can you walk? He asked. Yes? She said it like she'd been waiting to prove it. Okay. He helped her up. She was steady, steadier than he expected, her legs working correctly, her spine straight. And he kept his arm around her shoulders and turned toward the door. Deacons was in the doorway. Her face was wrong. Not grief wrong, not discovery wrong, urgently wrong. The face of a person who has just received information that has changed the timeline. We have a problem, she said. Ryder looked at her. Warren Cole left his residence approximately 40 minutes ago. His vehicle was picked up on a traffic camera on Route 9 westbound, then turned. She paused. He's heading here. The barn went very still. How long? Ryder asked. 8 minutes, maybe less. 8 minutes. Ryder looked at Carla. At her face, the steadiness in it, the specific quality of a person who has survived the unsurvivable through the application of very small, very sustained decisions. He looked at Delt across the barn, at Tessa Aldrich standing now, supported by 2 investigators, her eyes moving around the space with the disoriented deliberateness of someone recalibrating to the existence of choices. He looked at Mackey in the doorway, at Hatch behind Mackey, at the others beyond. Get them out, he said to Delt. Out of the barn and to the vehicles. Now. Delt was already moving. Ryder turned to Deacons. You need to position your people on the access track. He's going to try to turn around when he sees the vehicles. We have authority to detain him on approach, Deacon said. I need you to stay clear. I intend to, Ryder said. She looked at him with the same quality of look that Voss had given him earlier. The question of whether to believe him hanging in the air between them, unanswered and unanswerable, because the only test of it was the next 8 minutes. He walked out of the barn. Outside, the pale winter morning hit him with the cold and the space, the openness of the farmyard after the confinement of the barn, the sky enormous and indifferent above the bare tree line. Delt and the investigators were moving Tessa Aldrich and Carla across the apron toward Voss's sedan, Carla walking under her own power with one hand on Delt's arm, not leaning on it, but maintaining contact, a choice that told him something about what contact had meant to her for 9 years. He watched her walk. He watched until she was at the car, until Delt had the door open, until she was inside and the door was closed and the car was between her and the rest of the property. Then he turned. Mackey was beside him. Had been beside him since the barn, close and steady, the proximity of a man who was not going to ask a question or offer commentary because neither was needed. He's going to know it's over, Mackey said, the moment he sees those vehicles. Yeah. He's going to run or he's going to try to control the narrative. He's good at that. He won't have the opportunity to do either, Ryder said. He could hear in the distance the sound of a vehicle on the access track, the soft crush of mud under tires, moving at the speed of a person who believed they were arriving at a property they controlled. Ryder looked at the track. He thought about Warren Cole's voice on the phone that morning, the warmth of it, the practiced architecture of it. 38 years of that voice telling him what was real and what wasn't, what required attention, and what was better handled by the people with the full picture, what strength looked like and what it didn't. He thought about a concrete wall with 38 scratch marks. He thought about the word resolved in an administrative transfer document. The vehicle came through the tree line, a dark SUV moving slowly and then more slowly as the driver registered what was in the farmyard. The state vehicles, Voss's sedan, the bikes, the people. Deacon's team, already repositioned, already visible in their task force jackets, already forming the geometry of a perimeter that had one way in and no easy way out. The SUV stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the driver's door opened. Warren Cole stepped out. 71 years old and still large, still carrying the physical authority of a man who had been the biggest presence in every room for 5 decades. The width of his shoulders not entirely diminished by age, the posture still carrying the habitual straightness of someone accustomed to looking down. He wore a dark coat, good quality, the coat of a man who maintained appearances. His face was composed in the particular way it composed itself when he was assessing a situation and calculating his best available move. His eyes found Ryder. Ryder was 20 feet away, standing in the mud of the farmyard between the barn and the house, not moving, not speaking, with his hands at his sides and his shoulder burning, and 9 years of the wrong kind of silence finally, at its end. Warren looked at him. Ryder looked back. And whatever Warren Cole saw in his nephew's face made the composure slip, just slightly, just for 1 second, just enough to show what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was not a man who was surprised. What was underneath it was a man who had known this day was eventually coming and had calculated many times that the calculation would always come out in his favor, and who was now, for what might have been the first time in decades, running the numbers and getting a different result. Deakins was moving toward Warren with 2 investigators flanking her. Ryder heard her voice, formal, precise, the language of authority being correctly applied, and heard Warren's voice respond, already pivoting toward the controlled narrative, already searching for the frame that would make this something other than what it was. Ryder did not move toward him. He stood where he was and let Deakins do what Deakins had the authority to do, and he kept his hands at his sides and his feet in the mud, and his eyes on Warren Cole's face, and he watched the moment, the specific, irreversible moment, when Warren understood that the architecture he'd built over 20 years had not been brought down by investigators, or case files, or jurisdictional reviews. It had been brought down by a 10-year-old girl running through the rain toward a motorcycle shop. Warren's eyes moved from Deakins back to Ryder. One last time. The look of a man trying to find in his nephew's face some remaining angle, some filament of the relationship that had once allowed him to say, "Give her space and be believed." There was nothing there. Ryder held his gaze until Warren looked away. And then Deakins was speaking again, and Warren's hands were being taken, and the composure was finishing its collapse in the particular ugly way that things collapse when they've been held together by pressure for too long. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in stages, each stage revealing the emptiness of what had been inside all along. Ryder turned away before it was done. He walked to Voss's sedan, opened the back door. Carla was inside, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from somewhere, her hands around a thermos of something Delt had found in his pack. She looked up when the door opened and her eyes went immediately to his face, reading it the way siblings read each other. Not the surface, not the performance, but the layer underneath, the place where the truth lives without editing. "Is it over?" she asked. Ryder looked at her, at the face he'd been carrying in the locked place for 9 years, at the marks that time and fear had made on it, and the specific quality of steadiness underneath those marks that told him she had not in 9 years lost the essential thing that made her herself. "Yes," he said. Then, because it was true, almost. She looked at him. "There's one more thing," he said. "I need to go back in the barn." She didn't ask why. She understood, the way people understand when they've been in a place long enough to know its complete dimensions, that there were 4 doors and one of the rooms had been empty, and empty was not the same as resolved. "Go," she said. He went. Back across the concrete apron, back through the main barn doors, back to the lower level with the 4 steel frames and the drainage channel, and the smell of chemical and wrong that no amount of cold winter air would fully displace. The investigators were working systematically through the space, photographing, logging, moving with the deliberate care of people building something that would need to hold in court. The 4th room, not Carla's, the first one they'd opened, the one that had been empty, had been re-examined. Deacons stood near it, looking at the floor. Ryder came and stood beside her. The floor of the room was concrete, same as the others, but in the corner farthest from the door, someone had looked more carefully than a first pass allowed, and what they'd found was a seam. A rectangle in the concrete, approximately 3 feet by 4, with a recessed metal handle set flush into the surface. Below-grade storage. A space below the space. A door inside a door. Deacons was on her radio. Ryder looked at the handle. He looked at it for a long time. In the barn above him, he could hear footsteps and voices and the systematic sounds of an investigation unfolding with the slow inevitability of a thing that could not be stopped now that it had started. Outside, he could hear Mackey's voice and Hatch's voice and the sound of a vehicle, Warren Cole's SUV, being turned around and driven out with someone else at the wheel. He could hear, faintly, the distant sound of more vehicles on Route 9, the forensic unit advancing. He could hear his own heartbeat. It was very loud in the concrete room, in the chemical silence, above the hidden door in the floor, in the space that had been designed to be invisible and had been designed that way by a man who had sat at a kitchen table and said, "Give her space," and had been trusted, because trust was the material that the architecture was built from, the load-bearing element without which the handle was cold under his fingers. Ryder gripped it and pulled, and the concrete panel came up on a counterweighted hinge. Someone had engineered this carefully, had thought about the mechanics of concealment with the patience of a person who intended it to last. And beneath it was a steel ladder, descending into darkness approximately 12 feet deep. Deacons was beside him with a flashlight before he could move. "Wait," she said. This time he waited. 2 investigators went down first. He heard their boots on the ladder rungs, heard them hit the floor below, heard the click of flashlights and the sound of breath being drawn and then held in the specific way breath is held when a person sees something that requires a moment before it can be processed. Then one of them called up. A single word. A name. Not a name Ryder knew. A name from the file. One of the 5, one of the women still classified as missing. A woman who had been missing for 4 years and who was alive in the space below the space. In the room that had been built to be forgotten. She was alive. Ryder sat down on the concrete step of the lower level and put his face in his hands and did not make a sound, because the sound that wanted to come out of him was not the kind of sound he was going to make in a barn in front of state investigators on a February morning. He held it. He contained it the way he'd learned to contain things, not by destroying them, but by acknowledging their size and choosing where and when they could exist. Delt found him there 4 minutes later and sat down beside him without comment and handed him a bottle of water from somewhere, and that was all either of them needed. The forensic unit came in at 11:40. By noon, the farm was a different kind of place, full of methodical, purposeful human activity, the yellow of evidence markers against the gray concrete, the voices of people doing the painstaking work of documentation that would eventually become the foundation of something that held. Deacons moved through it with the quiet authority of a person in her element, directing without drama, building the case one photographed surface at a time. Ryder stood in the farmyard and watched and let it happen around him. Warren Cole had been transported from the property at 11:15 in the back of a state vehicle. He'd said nothing after the initial formal exchange with Deacons, had apparently made a calculation that silence was his remaining best option, which was the calculation of a man who had spent decades understanding how systems worked and who now understood that the system had turned fully in a direction he could no longer manage. Ryder had not spoken to him, had not sought to, had stood at the edge of the farmyard and watched the vehicle leave and felt, in its absence, Not the satisfaction he might have expected, but something quieter and harder. The feeling of a weight that had been so long in place that its removal did not produce lightness so much as awareness of how long it had been carried. Mackie came and stood beside him. "Gavin Rodes," Ryder said. "The truck." "Deacons has his plates from Mackie's partial. They're running it." Mackie paused. "He was connected to Warren?" "Had to be. Warren didn't commit anything directly. He provided cover, killed the cases, redirected the investigations, made sure the administrative path was clear. Rodes was operational." Ryder said the word with a flatness that covered everything underneath it. "One of several, probably. The investigation will find the others." "And Avery." Ryder looked at him. "She ran to the right place," Mackie said, quietly. Not a compliment, not a conclusion, just a fact that needed to be said aloud so it could exist in the record of the morning. "Yeah," Ryder said. "She did." They drove back in the early afternoon. Carla rode in Voss's sedan with Tessa Aldrich and 2 investigators, headed for the county medical center for examination and documentation, the procedural necessities of the aftermath, the bureaucratic machinery of care that felt inadequate but was what existed. Ryder rode behind the sedan for the first 2 miles, close enough to see the shape of his sister's head through the rear window, and then fell back to his place at the front of the formation because the formation needed him there, and because watching the back of that sedan too closely was something he didn't have the capacity for right now. The ride back was quieter than the ride out. The engines the same, the road the same, but the quality of the air between them different. The particular quality of people who have been through something together and are now in the first minutes of the time that comes after. Hatch pulled alongside Ryder at a long, straight stretch and rode even with him for a 1/4 mile. He didn't look over. Ryder didn't look over. They rode parallel in silence, which was its own kind of language, and then Hatch dropped back into formation. Cold Iron Customs at 2 in the afternoon was the same shop it had been at midnight, with the same flickering light and the same wood stove and the same oil-stained concrete floor, and it was entirely different in every way that mattered. Ryder came through the front door, and Avery Quinn was sitting on the stool near the workbench with a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading, and she looked up when he came in with the same ancient, patient attention she'd been looking at him with since she'd run at him out of the rain. He sat down on the stool across from her. They looked at each other. "Did you find them?" she asked. "Yes." "All of them?" "All of them," he said. "Everyone who was there." She absorbed that. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it moved when she was processing something significant and deciding how to carry it. Then she looked down at the book in her lap and smoothed the page with her palm in a small, deliberate gesture and looked back up. "My mom's been in the back," she said. "She cried for a while. She's okay now." "I know she is," Ryder said. "Are you okay?" The question landed with the directness that only children deploy without apology. Not innocently, because Avery was not innocent in any naive sense, but honestly, with the full expectation of a real answer rather than a performed one. Ryder thought about it, gave it the weight it deserved. "Getting there," he said. She nodded as if this was the correct answer, and she'd been waiting to confirm it. Danielle Quinn came out of the back room 20 minutes later. Her eyes were clear in the specific way eyes are clear after crying that was thorough enough to clean something, and she moved with the particular quality of a woman who has set down a weight she's been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was separate from her body. She looked at Ryder, said nothing for a moment. "I want to take Avery to get something to eat," she said finally. "Clement's on the corner opens all afternoon," Ryder said. "I know." She paused. "I want you to come." He looked at her. "All of you," she said, and the you she meant included Mackie at the workbench and Delt by the stove, and Hatch in the doorway. "If that's... I just think you should all eat something. It's been a long night." It had been a long night. It had been a long 9 years. Clement's diner was warm in the way that old diners are warm. Not just heated, but worn warm. The warmth of a place that has had people in it continuously for decades. The heat absorbed into the vinyl booth cushions and the laminate tabletops and the particular smell of the place, coffee and bacon grease and something sweet underneath. The smell of ordinary human life proceeding in the way it proceeds when nothing terrible is currently happening. They took up 2 booths and an extra table pulled alongside, which the waitress, a woman in her 60s who had clearly worked there long enough to have seen stranger groups, accommodated without comment and with the efficiency of someone who understood that large, hungry groups did not require conversation, they required coffee and menus. The coffee came first. Ryder wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat of it move through his palms and up into the muscles of his arms and shoulders, and his left shoulder, which had been a grinding complaint for the entire morning, loosened fractionally. Not fixed, not resolved, just slightly less present. He would carry it the way he'd always carried it. It was part of the architecture now. Avery was across the table from him, sitting beside her mother, studying the menu with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up once and caught him watching her and didn't look away, just held his gaze with the directness she'd used from the first moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Ryder said. She went back to the menu. "The grilled cheese is good here," she said. "I've been here twice." "I know," he said. "I've been coming here for 6 years." She considered this. "And you never got the grilled cheese?" "I always get the egg sandwich." She looked up again with an expression of mild, genuine disapproval. "You should branch out." Mackie, to Ryder's left, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was closer to it than anything that had come out of him all day. Danielle put her hand over Avery's briefly on the tabletop. The same gesture she'd made in the shop the night before. The proof of presence touch. And Avery turned her palm up under it without looking away from the menu, the automatic response of a child who has learned to anchor and be anchored simultaneously. Ryder watched it. He thought about Carla at the medical center, the paperwork, the examinations, the procedural machinery of care being applied to her right now by people who were competent and careful, and not him. He thought about calling her and then thought about waiting, about giving her the time to go through the first necessary things without his presence as an additional weight, about trusting her to tell him when she was ready. He thought about 38 marks on a concrete wall. He thought about the patience required to make 38 marks. He picked up his coffee and drank. Delt was at the far end of the table, talking quietly with Hatch, the low, serious conversation of 2 men reviewing what had happened with the thoroughness of people who needed to understand it before they could set it down. Briggs and Cord were in the other booth, eating with the focused efficiency of men who'd skipped meals in stranger circumstances, the silence between them comfortable in the way silence gets between people who've been through something together. Mackie ate his eggs without speaking for 10 minutes. Then he set his fork down and looked at the window, at the gray afternoon light on the street, and said without turning, "You going to be able to sit still now, or are you going to find another one of these?" Ryder looked at him. "Another what?" "Another thing," Mackie gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed the night and the farm and the rain and all of it. "You found what you were looking for. Or it found you." He paused. "Question is whether you can let it be enough." Ryder considered that honestly, gave it the weight of real consideration rather than reflex. "The shop's still open," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have right now." Mackie looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked his fork back up. "Okay," he said. And that was the end of it, which was the right end for it. The diner filled slowly as the afternoon came in. The usual late lunch crowd, local faces, the ordinary population of a small Pennsylvania town going about the ordinary business of a Thursday. Nobody looked at their group with any particular attention. A bunch of men in leather jackets, a woman, a child with a book in her hands. Nothing remarkable in Harlow, which had never been the kind of town that found motorcycles remarkable. Avery had ordered the grilled cheese. She ate half of it and then slid the plate across the table toward Ryder with the pragmatic generosity of a child who has decided something should be shared and doesn't require a discussion about it. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. She had already gone back to her book, which she was reading now for real, her eyes moving across the page with the absorbed focus of a kid who reads the way other kids breathe, constantly, easily, as natural as staying alive. He ate the other half of her grilled cheese. She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly in the direction of something. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning with the first suggestion of something that might eventually become spring in the air. Not warmth yet, not even close, but a different quality to the light, a slight thinning of the gray. Ryder Cole rode his Harley down Baker Alley and parked in front of Cold Iron Customs and sat on the bike for a moment with the engine off and his hands in his lap and listened to the town. Avery Quinn was inside. He knew because Danielle had called the night before to say they were staying, that Harlow was home now, that the apartment on Callaway had been renewed for another year, that Avery had asked about the shop and whether she could help on weekends with small tasks, and Danielle had said she'd ask. Ryder had said yes before the question finished. Carla had called that morning, from a number he didn't recognize, which he answered immediately because he'd been answering numbers he didn't recognize since the farm. Her voice had the quality of someone learning to use it again. Not weak, not uncertain, but careful, like a person who has been somewhere that didn't value their voice and is now determining how much of it remains. "I start the counseling on Monday," she said. "Good," he said. "They said 6 months minimum." A pause. I said, "Okay. I've waited longer for things." He'd had to put the phone down for 3 seconds at that. Just 3 seconds. She waited without comment. "I'll be here," he said when he picked it back up. "I know," she said, and meant it in a way that was different from the last time he'd said something similar. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of the architecture of a relationship that had been interrupted and was now, carefully, resuming. He sat on his Harley in the thin February going March light and thought about that. About architecture. About what gets built and what gets destroyed and what gets built again in the space left by the destruction, usually smaller and sturdier than the original, built with the knowledge of what the original couldn't withstand. The shop door opened. Avery stood in the doorway in her jacket, her book under her arm, looking at him with the expression she'd been looking at him with since the first night. The ancient, patient attention of a child who had decided, at some point during the rainstorm, that this was a trustworthy place. "Mackie said you'd be out here," she said. He was right. He said you do this sometimes. Sit on the bike and don't go anywhere. He talks too much. She considered this. He said to tell you there's fresh coffee inside. Ryder looked at her for a moment. At the face that had started all of this, that had run through the rain toward the thing that looked dangerous and turned out to be the only safe thing available. The face that would carry what it had been through in the particular way that children carry things, not forgetting but incorporating, adding it to the structure of themselves as a layer of knowledge that most people never had to acquire. He got off the bike. He followed her inside. The shop was warm. The stove was going. Mackie was at the workbench doing something with a carburetor and not looking up, which was his way of saying everything was fine, carry on. Delt was in the back. The coffee was on the small counter, and it was fresh in the way that meant someone had made it recently knowing he was coming. He poured a mug. He stood at the workbench with the warm mug in his hands and the smell of coffee and engine grease and the low sound of the stove and his shoulder aching in its ordinary way, the way it would always ache, and looked at the space around him. The bikes, the tools, the cracked window with its strip of electrical tape along the lower seal, the fluorescent light above the tool rack that still flickered but hadn't gone out. Some things you fixed, some things you learned to work around. The distinction between them was the most important knowledge he had. Avery had climbed back onto her stool and opened her book. After a moment, she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the edge of the workbench without looking up. He picked it up, unfolded it. 6 words in a child's careful handwriting, the letters slightly uneven, pressed hard enough into the paper that the impressions showed through on the back. "Thank you for believing me." He stood with it in his hands for a long moment, felt the weight of 6 words, which was the same weight as 9 years, which was the same weight as 38 marks on a concrete wall, which was the same weight as a small girl running through the rain toward the dangerous thing, because the dangerous thing turned out to be the only honest thing left. He folded it carefully. He put it inside his leather vest, against the left side of his chest, in the space below the collarbone where the tightness had lived for 9 years, and was now, very slowly, beginning to learn a different way to exist. Outside, on Baker Alley, the morning was proceeding. The town was small and worn and slightly broken, in the way that all real things are slightly broken, and the light was the thin, honest light of a season that hadn't decided yet whether to stay cold or begin to change. Inside Cold Iron Customs, someone made a joke Ryder didn't catch, and Mackie laughed. The real one, the one he kept for moments when he forgot to contain it. And the sound of it filled the shop and went out into the morning and dissipated into the ordinary air of a Thursday in Harlow, Pennsylvania, indistinguishable from any other sound. Just men in a shop, doing the work, staying warm.